You are listening to SRM Insider. This is the Cyber Intelligence Briefing, your weekly roundup of the latest cybersecurity news and insights, straight from SRM's leading global incident response team. Welcome to another episode of SRM's Cyber Intelligence Briefing. I'm Kyle Schwebler, and I'm joined by my colleagues Miles Arkwright and James Teitler. Hello. Hi, everyone. This week, we'll be discussing the ongoing impact of three major software vulnerabilities being actively used to spread ransomware, including to the world's largest bank, the ICBC. The ICO has dropped its investigation into EasyJet, and an Australian court has ruled that an incident report made by telecoms giant Optus is not covered by legal privilege. We'll also discuss how ChatGPT was taken offline by a major DDoS attack, and cover the news that the short-lived ransomware operation Ransomed VC has shut down following law enforcement pressure. Well, I think we can kick off this week's episode with the news that the UK's data protection regulator, the ICO, has dropped their investigation into a 2019 data breach at EasyJet, which at the time, I believe, was the largest data breach the country had ever seen. The ICO said it was dropping the probe because pursuing enforcement action would not be the best use of its limited resources.
Yeah, so the ICO have supported the decision by saying it sometimes has to make difficult calls about which cases to pursue and which ones to drop. But I really think that given the scale of the EasyJet breach, this risks potentially sending the wrong message to companies about their obligations to data subjects under the GDPR, and also the sanctions they'll face if they do not comply.
Absolutely. Thanks, James. And in other legal and regulatory news, a judge in Australia has rejected the telecoms giant Optus's claims that an incident report regarding a 2022 cyber attack was subject to legal privilege. Optus is facing a class action lawsuit over the breach, which has affected over 10 million customers.
It's a really interesting development. We encounter legal privilege considerations on many of the incidents that we respond to. I've asked Chloe Sevil, a senior associate in the cyber practice at Kennedy's, a global law firm with particular experience and expertise in cyber incident response, to join us and share some thoughts on this latest development. Welcome, Chloe.
Hi, Carl. Nice to be here.
Chloe, it might be helpful for our listeners if you could just provide a brief overview of what legal privilege is and why it's important in the context of a cyber incident.
Yeah, definitely, Carl. So legal professional privilege is a term that we use to talk about being able to protect, say, a report or communications that go out when we're dealing with a cyber incident. So, for example, if a business has experienced a cyber incident, they usually engage a forensic provider to prepare a report into what's gone on, how long the compromise lasted for, et cetera, et cetera. And that report is usually prepared to assist that organization and its legal counsel understand what the legal and regulatory impacts of that incident are. Privilege allows that client to keep that report just to itself and not need to share it with, say, regulators or other third parties.
Thanks, Chloe. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And obviously we know that in this case, the Australian court denied that legal privilege applies to the Optus incident report. Are you able to explain why the court took this view?
Yeah, definitely, Carl. And perhaps before I go through that question, I do just want to place the significance of this breach for your listeners, and especially those in the UK who might have heard that name floating around, but might not be aware of the significance of that breach in Australia. So last year, Australia had two significant, if not historical, breaches. One was the Optus data breach. So Optus had a data breach in September. The reason why it's significant is because Optus is Australia's third largest telecommunications. So in terms of the services that it provides, it would provide telco services to, millions of Australians. And when this data breach occurred, it impacted, upwards of or just under 10 million Australians. So nearly a third of the population. That, of course, attracted a humongous amount of regulatory attention, certainly political attention. It was in the news for several weeks. And now, from a privacy perspective, it, along with the other data breach, is occasioning quite a lot of regulatory change in Australia. So that I just want to place that in context for your listeners, because it is quite significant. In terms of the case that you're referring to, so this was only handed down a few days ago on the 10th of November. And the key point that the judge was considering in this case is of course, privileges, which is what we're talking about. So Optus, of course, wanted to preserve privilege in the report that Deloitte prepared for Optus after the incident occurred. So it was saying that, the report was prepared, for the purposes of Optus understanding the legal and regulatory implications of the incident. However, why this case was significant is because the judge actually rejected that assertion, and it looked at a few things to reject that assertion. So what became clear if you read the judgment is that the judge actually looked to media statements that Optus's CEO made around the time and a bit later. And also looked at board resolutions and what the board was saying about why Deloitte was engaged and why this report was important. And the judge looked at those materials and said, it's clear to me that this report and Deloitte's engagement was not for the sole purpose of Optus obtaining legal advice. And if you want to maintain privilege in a document or communications, that report has to be prepared for the sole purpose of obtaining legal advice. It's not enough that, obtaining legal advice is mixed in and around with other purposes. It has to be the sole purpose. And the judge looked at those media statements and the board resolutions and said that it was clearly prepared for other reasons other than allowing Optus to understand its legal and regulatory obligations.
That's really interesting. I can imagine maybe a few lawyers and maybe some organizations might be treading lightly going forward. What impact do you think this ruling could have on the cyber landscape, in Australia, but also the rest of the world going forward?
Okay, yeah, that's a really good question. So, look, reading the report, I'm not thinking that the judgment has any particular change. It's not changed the law in terms of privilege. It hasn't done anything like that. I think what this case is going to serve as is a really good reminder of the importance of a few things for clients who are experiencing a cyber incident and for counsel and for forensic providers as well. So what are these takeaways? It's really clear on reading the judgment that if you're preparing a report, it has to be done under the umbrella of counsel. So Optus engaged a law firm in Australia called Ashurst to help it with the cyber incident. However, it looks like Deloitte's scope of works wasn't really referred to by Ashurst, etc. So in terms of the takeaways, when you've got a cyber incident and you're looking at engaging forensics, your counsel needs to be engaging the forensic firm from the get-go. Your law firm needs to be in there right from the beginning, and the forensics scope of works needs to refer to legal counsel engaging the forensic team. Second point, whilst this case focused on maintaining privilege, there's also a point to consider with respect to how you can not waive privilege. So in terms of waiving privilege, you can do that by disclosing a report of communications to third parties. So I suppose in the insurance landscape, I suppose brokers and carriers are often interested in obtaining copies of reports. That's understandable because it contains information about a breach. But there's a real risk that if a report goes outside the small circle of client, counsel, and forensic provider, your argument to maintain privilege is really weakened. So the takeaways from this case are that when you engage forensics, your legal counsel needs to engage the forensic team, and it needs to be really clear that the sole purpose of doing the forensics is to get legal advice. And secondly, keep any report prepared within the small circle of counsel, client, and forensic provider.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thanks so much, Chloe.
Thanks, Carl.
Yeah, thanks for that insight there. It's really great to hear how our legal partners are thinking about these issues. And in other news, last week, the widely used AI chatbot ChatGPT suffered major service disruptions caused by a DDoS attack. The attack was claimed by Anonymous Sudan, who were a hacktivist group believed to be affiliated with the pro-Russian group Killnet. And interestingly, in the same week, Anonymous Sudan also claimed responsibility for a DDoS attack, which briefly took the website of cybersecurity provider Cloudflare offline.
Yeah, to put it simply, a distributed denial of service attack involves overwhelming website with malicious traffic, causing it to be taken offline. The barrier for entry for these DDoS attacks is fairly low at the moment, with regular reports of DDoS for hire packages being sold on the dark web. With all that in mind, organizations with a reliance on public-facing API services must consider the business impact that a DDoS-inflicted service outage could have on their operations.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Miles. And moving on to another interesting story this week, the ransomware group Ransomed VC announced that it was shutting down after 6 of its affiliates were arrested. The group first appeared in August this year and since then has claimed a number of high-profile attacks, including one against Sony in September. They were a rather unique outfit, and some security researchers actually disputed some of the group's claims.
Yeah, that's right. So Ransom VC were quite a short-lived operation, but they generated a lot of attention in the security community for their unusual behavior. So last month, they were attempting to sell off their infrastructure, including their leak site and ransomware builder, claiming they were under pressure from law enforcement. Now, we don't have any details about who these 6 affiliates who were arrested are or where they were based, but the operators of Ransom VC also said in their statement that the affiliates were inexperienced and had practiced poor operational security.
Yeah, I think this shows that the barrier to entry for new ransomware groups is relatively high, as there is a need for a degree of professionalism to successfully carry out attacks on high-profile targets. And as we often say, law enforcement pressure can shut down specific cybercriminal groups, but these individuals will often rebrand or join other operations.
Yeah, and speaking of these professionalized ransomware groups, LockBit have continued to make headlines. So last week, they claimed an attack on the US arm of the Industrial and Commercial Bank of China, or ICBC, which is currently the largest bank in the world by total assets. The attack caused massive disruption as traders were reportedly forced to send details of US Treasury settlements to partners on a USB stick via courier. LockBit also claimed an attack on the multinational law firm Allen & Overy, and have also begun leaking data stolen from Boeing on their dark web leak sites.
Yeah, so no real signs of them slowing down then?
Yeah, and like I said, I think last week that LockBit have been, probably the biggest and most prolific ransomware group for the last few months, if not years. We've also seen 3 critical software vulnerabilities being actively exploited by threat actors. The first one I want to touch on is called CitrixBleed and impacts NetScaler application delivery controllers and NetScaler gateway appliances. There's also a vulnerability affecting on-premise Atlassian Confluence service, which is being used to deploy ransomware. And then the last one is a vulnerability that Microsoft raised, which is impacting the SysAid ITSM software. And that's also being exploited by what appears to be the same threat actor behind the MOVEIt and GoAnywhere breaches that we saw earlier this year.
Yeah, thanks, Carl. Quite a bit to unpack there. And I suppose starting with the CitrixBleed vulnerability, there are indications that this vulnerability was used by LockBit to hit both ICBC and Boeing. There is no confirmation at present, but security researchers identified that both companies had publicly accessible devices, which should have been vulnerable shortly before both attacks took place.
Yeah, I think this really goes to show that threat actors waste no time in exploiting software vulnerabilities. They'll often have gained access to dozens of corporate networks before a patch can be released. In SRM's incident response team, we've seen several incidents over the past week where the Confluence vulnerability was the method of entry. And, in the case of these major vulnerabilities, it could be worth just disconnecting any vulnerable assets from the public internet entirely before a patch becomes available.
Yeah, speaking of patching, there is now actually a patch available for both the Atlassian Confluence server vulnerability and the SysAid zero-day vulnerabilities.
Yeah, that's right. So it was Microsoft who alerted SysAid that the same threat actor behind the MOVEIt and GoAnywhere data breaches earlier this year, you'll recall that was the Clock ransomware group, was exploiting the software vulnerability in the SysAid on-premise platform to spread its ransomware. So SysAid were fortunately able to act quite quickly and create a patch within a few hours, and that has been released, and organizations are advised to apply that as soon as possible.
Yeah, that's right. And thankfully, so far, the impact of the SysAid vulnerability does not appear to be on the same scale as the MOVEIt breach, but it can often take some time for the full extent of the damage to become clear from these sorts of incidents. And I'd also add that because the vulnerability impacts on-premise deployments, remediation of any impacted systems will likely need direct physical intervention, and this can be slow and costly.
Yeah, thanks, guys. Thanks. That brings us to an end of this week's episode.
Thanks, Carl. Goodbye.
Until next week, goodbye.